which of those legal impediments are the sort of most prominent, and what has been happening sort of from a timeline standpoint with regard to them.
Okay, as you said, I'm Bruce McMullen. I'm the Chief Legal Officer for the City of Memphis. And right now, and one thing that's very important to know, prior to 2013, the city had total control. They could have taken down any one of those monuments by a vote of the City Council and the Mayor. So that's prior to 2013. In 2013, the first act was put forth by the state legislature, and that was the one that she described first, and that requires a simple majority vote, and you file a petition for a waiver to be excluded from the act and allowed to remove the statute. So right now we have pending before that body a waiver petition. Alan Wade, Alan is the lawyer on that specifically, and that was filed, I think, about within the first 100 days of this administration taking office. And that's what we have pending, and that applies to the Nathan Bedford Forrest statute.
Okay. And just by way of background, before 2013, the names of the parks were different, and and I don't know, maybe Mr. Wade, you're better able to speak to this. The names are no longer what they used to be. If you could just provide a little background on that front.
Probably Senator Harris and I would probably need to speak to it. He was a member of the council at the time. When that was done, we were faced with the specter of the 2013 Act being enacted. And we knew the General Assembly was considering it, and the council had prior to that been debating whether to rename the parks after Ida B. Wells, a number of different things. We couldn't come to any consensus on that. But once the General Assembly threw down and said, look, we're getting ready to prevent you from renaming the parks, the council then adopted a resolution before the 13 Act was adopted, renaming all of the parks. I remember having a discussion with Senator Harris at the time about trying to come up with some names, and I think he and I basically said, let's just do some generic names and for the time being, and we'll come back at some point and try to make them permanent. So that's what happened. So we got under the wire in terms of changing the names of the park, and I think that was the primary focus of the 2013 Act. They knew we had been talking about it, and they tried to prevent us from doing it before we actually changed the names.
Sure, and then just for clarity's sake, we have up here the City of Memphis City Council attorney and the City of Memphis attorney. So, Mr. Wade, if you could just take a second just so everybody's on the same page and explain the difference between those two positions.
Well, from an ethical point of view, we both represent the City of Memphis. The City of Memphis is composed of a legislative council and a city mayor and administration under him. The charter provides for a city attorney to represent both bodies, but primarily the city administration. I provide legal advice to the legislative body.
Okay, so you provide legal advice primarily to the City Council, and Mr. McMullen, your advice is primarily to the mayor and administration. Is that fair?
Close enough.
Okay.
It's a kind of complex relationship, as Alan kind of alluded to. Alan provides advice to City Council, and I am by charter the city attorney and kind of provide, I guess, advice to the City Council and everybody. And oftentimes I do hire Alan on behalf of the city to represent us in certain issues. So, sometimes Alan is working for me, and sometimes he's working for himself. Sometimes he's working for himself.
Sure.
You know, the clarification is, you know, we have this doctrine of separation of powers in American government, and so there is, you know, we work cooperatively with the city attorney, and but nevertheless, we have different masters sometimes where those interests diverge, and they're entitled to have independent advice in administration. we often collaborate to try to work things out if we can, but it's actually above our pay grade to be making those decisions. It's actually the mayor and the council.
Sure.
Actually do that.
Okay. Ms. Sawyer, I turn to you. We've talked a little bit about legal impediments, and I just want to tell all of you, if you have something to add to, you shouldn't have to wait for a question from me. Just pipe in, as now we will see happen.
So I just want to comment a little bit on the background here, because
Sure.
this has been a long time coming, and some of the really early proponents of this, of course, as Alan, I'm sure would agree, was Walter Bailey on the County Commission. He's certainly been pushing this for a very long time, and Myron Lowry. And Myron Lowry, at least when I was on the council, took the position that there was some path forward, and he took the position that the path forward was one of compromise. Because at least back in the day when I was on the council, it was clear that there were no votes, or there certainly was not a majority of votes to change the names of those parks or disturb anything that was happening at the Confederate Park, at those Confederate parks or monuments, which has stood for 100 years. And so enter Myron into the picture to broker a deal, a compromise, and I think Alan alluded to it. It was going to be the Ida B. Wells / Nathan Becker Forest Park. That's what we were going to. But literally, that is about as much as we could get done.
Yeah.
That was an uphill battle. I mean, think how far we have come, because Ida B. Wells Nathan Becker Forest Park as a proposal was an uphill battle, and Myron surely would not have had the votes for even that, much less to go further at that time. And originally I certainly didn't care much about the issue. I'd grown up in Memphis and didn't think much about the issue. But we had a meeting, one of the city council meetings, many meetings, to talk about this issue. And the Sons of Confederate Veterans came in, and I'm not trying to castigate all of them, but certainly the ones that came to that meeting strutted in. They strutted in because they were quite confident that they were in control of everything that was going to occur with respect to our parks. And I sat in that meeting and heard them say things about slavery and how it was positive for black folks and provided jobs and so forth. Right in the meeting, 2 council members at City Hall, and Janice Fullylove, who's still on the council, of course, left that meeting crying and in tears. And so that's how I came to get involved in it. Not that I, thought about the issue very seriously until I heard what at least those groups, but the people in that room were surely extremists. Now, maybe not all people that care about history are extremists. I'm fine with that. But the people in that room, the way they made their presentation, they were extremists. And to hear extremists tell me what they thought about that park and its name made a lot of us live it. Certainly, Alan was always ready to lock and load. So he was a valuable tool throughout that whole period. And eventually, we had a bunch of resolutions and so forth. I just wanted to do the placeholder name like Alan talked about. And finally, Alan came up with some placeholder names that could get votes. And even then, we only got 9 votes. It was unanimous, but we got 9 votes out of, what is it? 13?
You had 2 that didn't vote.
Yeah, so we didn't get everybody, but it was unanimous. And the only reason we got those votes was because of the specter of the Tennessee legislature intervening, because there was no other way we were going to get those votes at that time. It was clearly an uphill battle. So that was the history.
If you'll excuse me, Ms. Sawyer, I just want to just follow up on something Lee said. I mean, what galvanized the effort was when the General Assembly tried to tell us what we couldn't do. And I think you have to divorce what we're talking about. I mean, we're talking about some monuments, but it's a more fundamental question of the General Assembly directing the municipal government, power and authority about what you cannot and cannot do for the public's benefit. We are the closest to the people. We know what they want, and we should be the ones making that decision. So a lot of people that weren't on board got on board fast when the General Assembly started saying you can't do something. So, I mean, I'm glad you reminded me of that. That was a real important part of it.
So, Ms. Sawyer, turning to you, and just before I do, I just want to note, we have representatives from the state, from the city council, from the activism community here. We did have an invitation out to Tennessee Historical Commission to participate in this panel, and weren't able to make that happen, but that's sort of the other player in this, or another player in this in this situation. But I turn to you, sort of two separate questions that pick up on a couple of things that people have said. So Professor Harris said he grew up in Memphis, didn't ever really think about these parks, and was galvanized by this moment, this nation. So, one question is sort of why now? Why is this an issue to push forward today? And then the second, as we think about the legal impediments that have been described, what's your understanding of sort of where we stand? There is the waiver request pending. I know that there was action taken earlier this week about a meeting that's coming up next week or a couple weeks from now. So if you could just add some detail on either of those fronts or both, if you're up for it.
Absolutely. So first, thank you, to Demetria, Black Law Students Association, University of Memphis, for having this important panel. So to give context about why I believe it's important, native Memphian, lived here from the age of 10 on. My mother is a Memphian, graduated from St. Mary's, and yeah, I grew up not paying much attention to parks either, I was usually listening to Backstreet Boys in my room, so parks were not important. But I left to attend law school in DC, was in DC for 10 years, and returning home to Memphis, was lured back home by the shiny veneer of this millennial return movement, this Choose 901 movement, and all the great things that I was seeing happening economically and development-wise in the city. And then when I returned back home, I was really struck to see how much racial inequity still existed in our city, and the amount of economic advancement that had been rescinded from people of color in Memphis. There's a New York Times article that talks about how Black people in Memphis have lost decades of gains. The racial wealth gap in our city is the average Black person has access to $2,000, the average white person has access to $94,600. That's our current racial wealth gap. And so when I put these facts out, but to frame why these statues became an issue for me, they stand and they represent the lack of economic and political power that Black people have in a city where they are the majority. If we had economic and political power in this city, we'd be able to say Nathan Bedford Forrest is an odious person in history and should be removed immediately. If we had economic and historical power, we would be able to quote the words of Jefferson Davis, where he said that Black people were unintelligent and would never rise to much more than being able to pick cotton for white men. And we would say this statue needs to be removed immediately. And so what I'm fighting, in addition to the statues, is the lack of economic and political power that Black people have in a city where they are the majority. But not only are we the majority, we are the majority as in terms of educational inequity, we are the majority in terms of poverty, and we are the majority in terms of lack of access to fresh food, in terms of lack of access to health care. So we are a majority in all of the wrong ways. So when I see these statues, for me, it's a big artistic painting of the inequity that stands. So getting them down is not going to solve that problem, but getting them down allows us to continue to push this conversation. Would I have had the opportunity to state all of those facts in front of a prestigious gathering such as this today if we weren't arguing about statues? Would I have the opportunity to continue to remind people about the racial wealth gap that exists in our city? Probably not. And people don't want to listen. And so we're making them listen. And we're using the statues, and we're going to get the statues down, and we're going to continue to fight. We don't go away when the statues come down. We continue to bring attention to racial inequity in the city because it can't continue to exist. We are at a critical forefront with 2018, 19, and 20 approaching. We have redistricting coming with the 2020 elections. And so Black people and our allies have to continue to stand for justice, whether it's removing these statues or fighting this racial wealth gap, fighting educational inequity as it stands in our city. So that's what the statues mean to me as a 35-year-old today. Secondly, as far as the legal standing goes, I'm not a official attorney like the gentleman around me. I am a self-proclaimed law school dropout. I did a year and a half at Howard Law. But So I've spent a lot of time with the statutes. I've spent a lot of time with the history of the fight for the statue removal and the park renaming, and not just here in Memphis, but looking at the wave of what's happening around the country, what other cities are facing, whether it's removing the Confederate flag in South Carolina or removing the statues in New Orleans. Everyone's kind of facing their own legal battle. We've seen now in Ohio, the mayor removed statues and private industries are replacing the statues, right? So it's a very interesting fight. And to see how people who, these extremists as Lee called them, but extremists who have a unique access to power and to money, and so are able to spread their brand of hatred very widely and rapidly, to the point where what would be considered a false rhetoric almost becomes the standard things that we quote. So we're often on the offensive when we're on the side of right. And so really quickly, what drives me in this legal fight is the words of Dr. Martin Luther King, who we all know we're recognizing the 50th anniversary of his assassination right here. In his letter from Birmingham jail, quotes St. Thomas Augustine, and he talks about an unjust law. And we often just say, oh, quoting Dr. King, an unjust law is no law at all, but he goes further and he shares with us that an unjust law is a human law that is not rooted in eternal law and natural law. Any law that uplifts human personality is just. Any law that degrades human personality is unjust. So where we stand with Take 'em Down 901, and where I stand personally, is that we are faced with an unjust law. This is a law that degrades human personality. This is a law that was built and drafted by Lee Miller, who is the leader of the Memphis Brigade of the Sons of Confederate Veterans. He has claimed responsibility for the drafting and lobbying for the Tennessee Heritage Protection Act. And knowing this, we know that in its roots, it is an unjust law that was created to protect Confederate statues. Statues that weren't built in the name of history, but statues such as the article that came out just today by Mother Jones, in Mother Jones, statues that were built directly to oppress and intimidate people of color at the moments when we were rising in economic power in this city. 1905, you've got Bill Street merchants, you've got the black economic class rising in Memphis, and it's attacked with violence, with riots. Ida B. Wells is run out of the city. Nathan Bedford Forrest, $38,000, a large sum at that time, is raised not only to place the statue, but to build an ice rink so little white children can skate outside while black kids are fighting for educational equity and afraid for their lives and watching their parents be dragged out of their homes and lynched. 1960s, you have Jefferson Davis, built in a field of lilies which were planted in the shape of the Confederate flag. Why was he built at that time? In direct response to Board of Education and forced integration, which we know was not a success in Memphis. We have a segregated school system today. So it is a very important and relevant issue, and it is not one that should be treated lightly. And so my request has been made respectively. We have made it through letters. We have made it through a petition with almost 5,000 signatures that was delivered to the mayor, to city council, to the Tennessee Heritage Commission, to the governor. We've taken all of the proper channels, and we've also taken to the streets. And we've done all of this. And there's 7 people who today are fighting to get their cases dismissed in a city that says that they agree with them and stand on the same side. And so my question is, if we're fighting an unjust law, why don't we make the moves? Why don't we make the moves to do what is right? We have the standing to do so. And these 2 gentlemen have come from different sides. Cover it up, don't cover it up. We can do something, well, we can't do anything. Unleash the dogs, don't bark too loud. And so I'm kind of confused where the city stands, but I know where we stand. They need to come down now.
So I guess I'll turn to you, Mr. McMullen. Made the case here that Tennessee Heritage Protection Act is an unjust law. Why not just take them down?
We can't, and this is a very good learning moment for the law students here. There's a process, And when you become a lawyer, you'll understand there's a process in which we solve disputes in this country, and it's through the legal process. And what we're doing is we're following that process. What is set before us is a Tennessee Historic Commission. They have a process in which we apply for a waiver, and we're following that process, and that's what we're focused on. I do agree with Ms. Sawyer about the history of the statute. I do agree that it's a statute that was put there to oppress. I do agree that it does not represent the sentiment of this community at this time. Those things we can agree on. But the approach that we're taking and the approach that a lot of you young lawyers will learn when you graduate, take the bar, is you have to follow the legal process. And that's what we're doing. And keep in mind, the mayor is also a lawyer. The mayor cannot order someone to break the law in order to meet a certain end. He has an obligation. He took an oath as a politician, and he took an oath as a lawyer. He has to follow the law. I am the chief legal officer for the city of Memphis, and that's what we're doing. We're going through the process, and I understand the sentiment of Mrs. Sawyer. I understand how popular this has become, especially since Charlottesville. I'd like to point out to you that this administration, within the first 100 days, filed a petition to have that statute removed. Before the Charlottesville incident, before this became popular on the news with everyone, we took those efforts and we filed a petition, and we're going through the process.
Can I just respond directly to that?
Sure.
We also were active before Charlottesville. These signatures on this petition were collected before Charlottesville. We held a public meeting before Charlottesville. This is not a popularity contest. This is something that I've been talking about since I returned to Memphis, and many others have brought up as well. So that's not what this is about. This is not about being popular. This is not about getting people because of what happened in Charlottesville. Now, Charlottesville caused a wave of people entering to the streets, but us following a process to push this movement forward, we had been on that process and in communication where, as I stated, the mayor himself was addressed on this petition before then. And again, you know, I just think back to when James Meredith attempted to integrate Ole Miss, and the governor sent the National Guard down to keep him from entering into the campus. And so I think about the ways in which we have the confidence and courage in which to say that we know that this law is unjust, but laws are laws.
So if I could just follow up with Mr. McMullen. So I think October 13th, and you know, I may be getting this not entirely correct, but I think on October 13th, the commission was to consider the waiver request, and it sounds like that's not going to happen on October 13th.
Well, they've indicated that they're not going to hear the waiver request on October 13th, but
Okay.
the mayor and I and Mr. Wade intend to be there to make an oral request for them to hear the petition at that time.
Okay.
And I'd like to point out, this is not from our perspective, the administration's perspective, we welcome the efforts of activists like Mrs. Sawyer, because one of the things that we have to show on the waiver petition is what is the public sentiment. So having them to come on board, having them to have those petitions, sign those petitions, those things are very, very helpful.
Are you acknowledging the petition publicly then? Because the mayor's not yet responded to the petition and then went and created his own when we collected 4,600 signatures. Is the city prepared to acknowledge that there's 5,000 plus people in support who he could use on his application for waiver removal for both Jefferson Davis and Nathan Bedford Forrest?
Absolutely.
Is the mayor prepared to respond to the letters that we've sent? I'm finishing my question.
I'm trying to wait till you finish.
Okay, absolutely. Is the mayor prepared? Are you now acknowledging the efforts?
You said that 4 times, and I'm going to answer your question.
Okay, sure.
Your
Let's hear
question,
it.
absolutely. We welcome any activists that want to show what the sentiment is of this community with removing those statues. That's one of the factors that the commission, the historical commission, should consider when they do that. Like I said before, within the first 100 days, we filed a petition to have that statute removed. I want everybody to keep in mind, prior to 2013, those statutes could have been removed without intervention at all with the commission or the state government. Those statutes have been there during that time. It was also during, the statutes were also, up until 2013 was the point in which the state jumped in, and Mr. Wade will talk about the efforts that were made to get petition filed. There was a 2016 act put in place to make it a little more difficult. So, to recap, in the first 100 days, this administration took efforts to remove the statute. We're following the law, we're following the process, and ultimately we think we'll be successful in removing those statutes.
So just one last question on this, and then I'd like to hear from you, Mr. Wade. Is there a point at which the process runs out, or do we follow the process? Is there a date in mind, or is there a point at which the city might feel that the process is not being in good faith followed, in which the city might be prepared to take action?
Yeah, I'll take it. First of all, let me clarify one thing that Ms. Sawyer commented on. I don't believe that the administration and the council are in different places. Quite to the contrary, I believe that the mayor is not the enemy. In fact, he's been very supportive of everything we've done. He's been very supportive of everything I've done when he was on the council and now while he's the mayor. While we may have intramural vigorous disputes, not disputes, but dialogue about the best approach to take, I fully concur that we have to pursue the legal remedies appropriately. We can be radical. We can be all the way radical to the ground. But when you go before a judge and an appellate court, some of whom have sympathies for the other side, we have to be reasonable. We have to make sure we have all our bases covered, and that's what we're doing. Now, at some point, you ask, are we going to run out of options? The ultimate option under both laws is the courts. We have to exhaust our remedies at the administrative level before we can go to the courts. What we're finding now is the Confederates and a lot of the Confederate members on the commission, they are fearful, partly because of your petition. But 5,000 signatures is not going to get it. We have to have a lot more than that behind it. It has to be a total commitment from our community that they don't want these statutes there anymore. Your petition is a start, but we got to have more than that. That's going to speak volumes not only to the Historical Commission, but to the General Assembly and all of the parties. I think the governor's on board, our senators are on, U.S. senators are on board. This movement is gaining steam, and we appreciate your efforts there. But it still has to be executed in the appropriate way. Under the 13 Act, I think it was glossed over, and I think we're here to talk about legal issues. So let's talk about some legal issues. The 13 Act made a clear distinction. There's a distinction if you have a memorial that's dedicated to a war. You cannot remove it under the 13 Act without a waiver. Under the 13 Act, if you have a memorial that's honoring a historic figure, she showed the language, I think it's in the second part, if you can go to the second part, it only requires a waiver to rename or rededicate. It does not require a waiver to remove. So we moved to file a petition before the 16 Act came into play because, quite frankly, Representative McDaniel recognized the loophole in his prior act, and he wanted to close that, and now you have to have a waiver to relocate a historical monument. And so we filed before the 16 Act became effective, and it's our position that we preserve all our rights to remove it under this act, and we just want the Historical Commission to confirm that. I mean, we can be radical, we can take them down, and we can fight in court, but I think a court will look unfavorably if we take it, we self-help, and don't follow the process. I believe that we cannot move that statute or get it relocated or get it repositioned with someone that may want to acknowledges historical commission like the Civil War Trust or the Department of Interior, unless we can demonstrate to them that we can pass good title. We can't pass good title by just moving it out and giving it to someone, because they'll be inviting a lawsuit. So we have to take all these things into consideration to try to make a reasonable approach. And I understand the activist wants these things done tomorrow, but I'm reminded when Abraham Lincoln was trying to get the 13th Amendment passed, which was the biggest barrier to black rights, he wasn't the enemy. He was following the process and ultimately had to convince Congress to pass that. So we're in the same posture. I don't think, we may have minor differences on how we go about it, but I will tell you, I think Mayor Strickland is very supportive of our efforts.
If I could,
We're not done until the Tennessee Supreme Court speaks on it. We have an avenue to appeal from the Commission to Chancery Court to the Court of Appeals and to the Supreme Court.
and what, in terms of timeline, how often does the commission meet? How do commission, or just sort of general parameters of this, how often does the commission meet? How is the commission appointed? Those kinds of questions. So this body that is considering or has the waiver before it, could you give a little context to that body?
So Alan may have been to some of these meetings, I've been to them in the past and so forth. As I recall, the governor appoints all the members of the Tennessee Historical Commission, and the governor himself serves on that body in an ex officio capacity, but he is a voting member. And so, of course, we've written to the governor and made sure that he knows that he's a voting member, and we've asked him to not just give statements, but also to commit his vote to return local control to the city of Memphis. But I should also say that the governor has come, he's still got a ways to go, but he has come a long way from where we started, because of course when the Tennessee Heritage Protection Acts were passed in the first iteration, we begged him to veto the acts or to stand against them, which would have been difficult for him to do, and he did not. But at least in the last few months, he has come out publicly in support of removing some of the Confederate monuments that are found in Nashville. So that's encouraging, but we need him to do a lot more. We need to make sure that he fills any vacancies on the Tennessee Historical Commission that would cast a vote in favor of local control of the city of Memphis. We need to make sure that he promises to vote in favor of local control of the city of Memphis. And we all on this panel need to do a lot more. And so there are a bunch of levers that we have still not pulled on this panel. So I'd love to see the public engage more, to be sure, like Alan talked about. I'd love to see, broader protest and even more signatures added to the petition. But there's some other things we can do. And maybe we're not there yet, but at some point, maybe the city council, for example, take some radical or at least some non-traditional steps to bring pressure to the members of the commission in Nashville and to bring pressure to the governor. Because I've been in politics for 6 years in elected office, and I can tell you, I don't know any politician that does anything unless you box them in. And so you've got to put a whole lot of pressure on them. And so there's some things we can do. Obviously, we could close the park. Right? We could put a fence around the park tomorrow, and I'm not saying we should do it tomorrow because we are not there yet, and we have a process to follow. So we're probably a long way from there, right? To be honest. But at some point down the line, maybe we close down the parks. That is a national news story if those parks are fenced in. If you have a national news story about the city of Memphis closing its park and fencing in that park, that will put so much pressure on the governor and the Tennessee General Assembly, and there will be all sorts of conversations about what happened in North Carolina and business drying up when they are also still with extremists. You put that kind of pressure on national politicians, and the ones you think won't bend, they bend very, very fast. We could also take even less radical, but still, other paths to kind of put some pressure on Nashville. Things like just stop maintaining the park. We roll around next spring, stop cutting the grass. Stop cutting the grass. If the grass is 6 foot tall, that is another national news story that the city of Memphis refuses to cut the grass at its parks because it doesn't have local control over them. That kind of national news story, to be sure, it hurts us, right? No doubt about it. But it really puts the pressure on Nashville, who holds the power to make this decision. And so you can get the politicians. They're not as courageous as we think. We put enough pressure on them, they will bend, and we will have a better chance of local control. So there's a lot of levers to be pulled. The public needs to get involved, like Alan said, but also elected officials have some levers that we haven't pulled quite yet.
And To respond to your question, additionally, the commission meets 3 times a year. So the next meeting after this is not scheduled until February. The next thing after that will be the April 4th commemoration of Martin Luther King's 50th recognition of his assassination here in Memphis. And then the next meeting would be after that in the summertime in June. So if we continue to follow the traditional channels as a city, the statues will stand when national attention comes to our front door on April 4th, that entire weekend. And we do understand that 5,000 signatures is just a start. Like, by no means do I think that that's more than less than 1% of the population of Memphis. But it's still a major start when you think about the political engagement of our city as well. And what we've asked and what would be a major boon to these signatures and to public attention is for collaborations, because, you know, I'm not an activist. I am a community member. I am a voter. I am a taxpayer. I am a resident. I work here. I am gainfully employed. I am a graduate of the University of Memphis. I can go on so forth. And so could many of the people who have signed those petitions. And so in addition to that, I do believe that while no one is saying that the mayor and his administration have totally turned their backs on this movement, what we're saying is that the public push, the activist community, the community engagement we have seen in support of Take 'em Down 901 and this pressure has been ignored, has not been, we have not been invited into the room to have these conversations, to build up the community support, to combine our petitions so that we can go from 5,000 to 50,000. And I think that's what we've been continuously asking the city to allow us to do.
Let me correct one point.
You can't correct me. You can edit.
I said, let me correct one point.
Okay.
The commission can call a special meeting to hear contested issues, so they don't necessarily have to wait until February to hear something. And if there's a contested issue, they can either have it heard by administrative judge, or the commission can call that special meeting. So there are more opportunities for the commission to convene and to execute on this.
And my statement was on scheduled meetings.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. So, Professor Harris, you mentioned a bunch of alternatives, and I guess I'll open this up to anybody. What are the consequences of doing that, of blocking off the park? Does anybody have standing to challenge that action, to put it in court into a different context? Is there a penalty? Is there a criminal penalty for doing something along those lines? Sure.
So I hate to comment on the legality of a lot of these steps, since we got some real experts in the room. But here's what I say. I do think we need to at some point take a serious look at what the legal repercussions of the various acts are. Because I think it is an open question, and I think that we have run wild with all the downside consequence, you know. Now I think Jim Strickland's doing a great, I think he's doing a pretty good job so far. And I think he is on our side. There's no doubt about that. I think there are a lot of folks that are on our side so far. But I do think that we have exaggerated some of these penalties. So if you or I, for example, go into those parks when they're closed, we could be convicted of criminal trespass. I can't imagine how city forces that go into a park that's closed would be guilty of criminal trespass. So those kinds of things, if we destroy city property, obviously we're guilty of something. I can't imagine how city forces that destroy city property could be guilty of something, right? They own the property. So those kinds of implications really need to be fleshed out a lot more, because a city action is not the same as a private citizen action where you would be subject to a full range of penalties, in my view.
When we think about the consequences as well, if you're talking about the public or the activist community, people have pulled back and have some fear about engaging directly because of the 7 people that were arrested on August 21st during the demonstration at the park. And knowing that those arrests were conducted by our city's police department and sheriff's department, and that there are still 3 people who are engaged in the process who have to continue to go to court, and that our city has, has not chosen to dismiss those charges. Really keeps people who have, again, we are a city with who is striving to make economic gains, but people have to work. People have to feed their kids. They cannot be in jail. They cannot be paying fees. And so when we talk about getting the public support, we talk about getting people out on the social justice. If our city is going to arrest people for engaging in public action, you're not going to have, that's the consequence you're going to see, is where we're afraid to participate.
I don't think the city has ever arrested anybody for engaging in public protest. The people that were arrested for violating the law. And as the chief legal officer, I represent the city, and I would never advise one of my clients to break the law. The mayor cannot order a city employee to break the law. That's a very serious thing. He can't do that as a mayor. He can't do that as a warden. You can't order someone to break the law, and that's what it would take to take some of those actions. So from my perspective, I would never advise him to do that. When there's a process in place, when we're moving forward in the process, and I'm well aware of the MLK 50, we're well aware of the impact of having those statutes up at that time, and we've taken that in consideration, and we're following the process. And so when you are governing, you have a different responsibility than when you are not governing and you're out there as an activist. You can do whatever you want to, you can say whatever you want to, but when you're governing, you took an oath of office, you have a certain responsibility, and you have people that work for you, and you have to make decisions that are legal and ethical for the people. And that is what we've chosen to do. We've chosen to follow the process, to follow the law, the very thing that they teach you in this law school. I mean, that's why this is all constructed. If no one had to follow the law and whatever they wanted to do, they could do, we would live in a lawless society. So that's the approach that we're taking on it, and we've taken that from day one. Our goal has been to remove the statute. And it's very important that we're one Memphis. I don't think anybody on this panel or anybody in this room, I think everybody is for removing the statute. I think the argument is, how do we do it? And I'm charged ethically to do it the legal way. That's the way we're doing it.
Yeah, I think to sum it up, I think what we're debating is whether to take action and seek forgiveness, or to take action by asking for permission first. As lawyers, we evaluate both courses. We evaluate the likelihood of success. That's our job. That's why we're hired. We're not hired just to make knee-jerk decisions. We're hired to evaluate the likelihood of success of either of those paths. And I believe we've weighed those options and believe that there's less likely that we could get forgiveness by taking action as opposed to getting permission on the front end. Now, there are some things that override all of this, and those are civil rights and public nuisance. There are other alternatives that we will pursue, but in the litany of options that we have to go in the priority that we believe we have the most likelihood of success. And that's why we're doing what we're doing. We have not ignored anything, trust me. Before this petition for 5,000 signatures came along, there was one little shade tree country lawyer that's been fighting this battle by himself, okay? Now we have the mayor's office, city attorney, everybody's on board. We're all doing this together. And I think we're gonna have a great likelihood of succeeding on this case.
So is it possible that there could be additional state laws passed that could put up further barriers
Absolute prohibition.
to removing the statutes?
It's possible. I mean, there's no doubt about it. It is a good issue for the base. We're just talking politics, and so I put my hat on as somebody in politics and government. And preservation of Confederate monuments is a pretty good issue for the Republican base. It is what it is. And so there's certainly going to be incentive for some of my colleagues in the Tennessee General Assembly to file bills that further protect and preserve these statues. Now, whether or not those will be passed is another question, because everybody kind of realizes that this is a politically explosive issue, and so hopefully more sober heads will prevail, and you won't see those kind of bills getting a lot of momentum. But yeah, I think we can bet that there will be bills filed. I would be doubtful though about what the likelihood of success is. I just don't know, because it depends on who's in the leadership and whether or not you're able to kind of slow down some of the folks that really want to do whatever they can to, burnish their credentials with the base. But just legislatively, right? We do have some other options, and I don't think the City Council, for example, has exhausted the full range of its powers with this. So the City Council, and I don't think they have, but they could set aside money to move the statue so that we could be in a kind of a posture of preparedness. If they set aside $100,000 that says this is the statue removal fund, again, that's another opportunity to kind of keep this on the radar. So there are things that we could do, I think, locally, but on a state level, the bills that will be filed are probably going to be bills to preserve. I should say this too, my colleague Sarah Kyle has filed a bill to return local control to the city of Memphis. And it's a tough piece of legislation to get through the General Assembly, but she did file it, and I think she's going to try to build out a coalition and try to get some momentum on it.
Could you just give a little bit of detail about what that means? Because we've talked a little bit about the dynamic between local governance and state governance, and I think students are familiar with the state versus the federal government breakdown, and that those are sort of separate governing entities, separate sovereigns on some level. The city government and the state government don't have that same relationship, but could you give a little detail either about that relationship generally or about what this bill that you mentioned, how it intervenes in that?
Sure. So I think for the most part, most folks in Nashville would say cities exist because of, and it's true as a lawful matter, cities exist because of a grant of the state. The state authorizes the cities. And so from the Nashville perspective, it is not radical to say we should be able to tell cities what to do. Now, you can contrast that with kind of the ideological bent of the Republican Party that says the government closest to the people is the one that works best, right? They've got that, right? They've got that on the campaign trail.
That's fun.
But when it comes to kind of thinking about the structural government, they don't really have a real problem with telling cities what to do. Cities exist because the state authorizes them, and they can tell cities to do whatever they want. Now, they would have a problem with the federal government telling states what to do, because obviously states are mentioned in the Constitution and so forth, right? But cities only exist because of the state. And one more piece of advice for the city council is that maybe we could even find a place to put these statues. I know years ago there was some talk of putting these statues in a cemetery and so forth. I don't know if the details of that has ever been worked out, but that's another practical move of working out a place to put those statues as we kind of build this file and go through a real process.
Yeah.
The reason that these monuments need to come down is the reason they were put there in the first place. They were put there to intimidate African Americans. That is the very reason they should come down. And I've heard Lee Millar say, get over it. It's been there 100 years. Let me tell you, right now, the disparity in wealth between African Americans and Caucasian citizens is significant. And this is not just in Memphis, but across the country. And the reason for that is, and I've been told that economists have said that it would take the average African American family 223 years to have the equivalent net worth of a Caucasian family. The reason for that is because we are operating from a huge deficit starting point. We don't have the same starting point. In fact, in 1860, up until that time, or 1863, I don't believe it was legal. It was un-American for African Americans to even go to school, to even read. So in the meantime, the white counterparts are going to college, they're building wealth, they're accumulating all this momentum, and we're starting from scratch. And so this continued presence of this monument, Forrest notwithstanding, he was a general and you can laud all his accomplishments, but it's not about who is there, it's about why it was there. And it was there to demean African Americans and continue to perpetuate this distinction in our cultures and wealth and everything else. And I think the continued presence of that thing is a thumb in the eye of our citizens saying, we are still in control and you will never catch up with us. So, I mean, I think that's the important thing to keep in mind from a social point of view. The legal things, we're going to fight those out. We're going to battle Nashville on this issue and many others. They don't like us. I mean, they don't like Memphis. Let's just be truth about it. And you know, you can look at the bill and see all of the Shelby County representatives that sponsored it and voted for it. Protest them. You know, those are the guys that are killing us. They're the enemy. It's not the mayor. It's these guys right here. It's Lee Harris's colleagues. I mean, they're not friends of his. But those are the people we need to be jacking up. We don't need them going back up there. I mean, and I'm on a soapbox here, and I'm getting away from the legal issues, but I just think that's important for everybody to keep in context.
Just want us to go down the row?
Sure.
Okay, great. So we are not only, and we being the Take 'em Down 901 movement, we have again made contact with all levels of government that are connected to this effort, from the governor to the Tennessee Historical Commission, to our city and county mayor, to the city council, where again we've delivered our documents and continued these efforts. So this was never a specific attack on Mayor Strickland, and while we continue to sit here and laud his efforts, you know, that's great, but the protests and the actions were to make a public push for removal and to bring this to the forefront of the administration, city council, everyone's efforts to have them removed. And I opened up by discussing many of those economic deficits that we are experiencing in the Black community. And I just want us to, as we think about this, not just in the legal context, but historical context, go back to 1954, where in Memphis, we were ordered by Supreme Court to integrate schools, and by all deliberate speed. And it took 7 years for the first schools to be integrated, and it took 13 parents to file a lawsuit through the NAACP Legal Defense Fund for their kindergartners to be the ones sacrificed, brave enough to integrate these schools. And the schools that they integrated are either closed today or they're 100% Black and Latino, and 100% low income. So in 1951, there was a legal standard to integrate schools and to ensure that there was no separation and that there was equality in schools. And our city government then chose to ignore that law because that's what they thought was right. And our city government then chose not to engage in the process that they were required to do because they felt that's what their people wanted. And they were talking about the people with the power. And so I continue to push as the activist on the panel and say, if the people are saying that this is what they want, the people that they have asked to represent them have the power and the right to be radical in this, in making this change.
So I just want to make a quick note. Today is actually the 56th anniversary of the desegregation of the Memphis City Schools. The 13 students, you know, I don't know how many know this, but it's a very special story for me. And it's the irony of the confluence of dates, just being here having this conversation 56 years to the day after we were going through a very different racial issue or race-related issue. I just want to acknowledge that, so go ahead.
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank the law school for inviting us here to hear this panel and to discuss this issue. And we think Memphis is all on one accord. We think we're one Memphis and we want to get those statutes removed. We applaud the protesters or anybody who want to raise public awareness about the statutes. We've been committed to doing that since day one in office. We've taken the necessary steps to preserve our rights. We're trying to follow through with the legal process, and Mr. Wade alluded to there are a lot of other legal options along the way that can be exercised, and we're going to exhaust all those legal options. Right now, we're before the Tennessee Historic Commission. We're following that through, and we will follow that all the way to the Supreme Court. We are well aware of the deadlines that are coming up, and but we will not ask any citizen or any employee to break the law. And we will continue to go through the process, and we think we're going to be successful ultimately. And that's
and I want to commend Tami Sawyer for really being one of the leaders of this current effort, because, let's give her a round of applause. Because she's doing this as a private citizen, so she doesn't come to this issue as some of us with, some help and a base and so forth. And so I couldn't imagine how difficult this must be for her. And I know we all hear that in her voice, the passion and the commitment there. And so, I'd love to see citizens disengaged on an issue, and I am hopeful that something good will come out of it. I am, though, a little encouraged because, I don't know, maybe my memories of 2013 and 2012 are just at the front of my mind, and I know in that period of time, there were threats. We had the KKK come to town. We just didn't have what we have today in terms of momentum. And even after we changed those parks' names back then, the front page of the Commercial Appeal the next day said, "It's done," quoting me saying it's done. I was younger and, it's done. Let's move on. This is over. It's done, as I said. They put that on the front page, but they did it as a joke, right? They did it as a joke, that this is a young council member that does not realize that we are not going to win this battle, that those names will return, right? They said, it's done, but, first sentence of the article is, but don't worry, it ain't over. Those parks will be back, or some such. So the point is we have come a long way. And even though I know some may think the mayor's not moving fast enough and so forth, I think he's got a great opportunity to really build a legacy. We know what happened with the sanitation workers, and the city was able to do a gift to those sanitation workers to recognize their contributions. This is another opportunity to build on a legacy of something that has gone unresolved for a very long time. And I think, based on everything I've seen, that he's going to try to take advantage of that. At the same time, we've seen a shift in the governor, who didn't have any courage on this issue several years ago when the Tennessee Heritage Protection Act was passed. And now he's out there standing on a principle. And while he may not be doing enough, it is still a positive change. So there's a lot happening that's encouraging. And so I want to try to end with a little bit of hope that this is going to happen, and this is going to happen in the reasonable future.
Well, again, thank you all very, very much for your participation. I think it's been a great learning experience for our students, for the community, and I hope that you enjoyed yourself. I turn it back over to Professor Frank.